Are you curious about bodies, pleasure, and possibilities? And what about curious about what others are up to on the planet when it comes to pleasure, sex, and play? Have you considered what pleasure can do for your life, your body, and your bank account? Do you know something magical, delightful, and out of this world orgasmic is not only possible for you, but totally available to you? If you're ready to be the magical, sexual, sexy beast you know you can be, and you just need the tools to get there, you're in the right place. Now, here's the host of The Pleasure Zone, sensual movement artist, relationship and sex alchemist, Milica Jelenic.
Welcome, my sweet pleasure seekers. For those of you who are joining me today, you might be curious about pioneers of sexuality and sexual liberation in the 20th century, because that's what today's topic is all about. Today, we're going to be looking at some of my top favorites that are sometimes hidden, I suppose. They're people maybe that you don't get to hear about, or maybe they're like unsung heroes that you just didn't realize the impact that they actually had. For those of you who are brand new to this show, The Pleasure Zone, we have over 400 episodes. As in sometimes I have guests on this show, but oftentimes it's me talking about all things sex, pleasure, and bodies, to going all the way from looking at things historical, biological, physiological, psychological, you name the angle, we take it. We do all positions here. So if you are interested in learning more about human sexuality, about your own, about things you can do just out of curiosity, maybe you're interested in kinks. We talk about that on here too. Maybe you just need some ideas because you're bored. Go back and listen to all episodes if you can. You'll find them on places like Spreaker, Spotify, iHeartRadio. You'll find it on YouTube. It's on 400 platforms, guys. You'll find it. Just look for it. It's also on the Inspired Choices Network app, which you can get for free. You can download it on Apple or Google as well. So one of the things that I love to talk about, which is why I have the Pleasure Zone show, is I love to talk with people all about having more pleasure in their life. And a lot of times people associate pleasure with sex. And today, when we're talking about sexual liberation pioneers, we are looking at it from the sexuality perspective. So we're not just like pleasure as in things that make you feel good, but we're talking about it from the pleasure perspective and people's philosophies and different ideas that they had on what we could do to have greater pleasure. And there are some amazing ideas that have been out there, some that have been highly disregarded, I suppose you could say, or people have not thought highly of some of the different methods. However, there are so many that are so fun that I have to share them with you guys. So one of the very first ones that I'd love to share with you is a fellow that I'm fond of. His name is Dr. Wilhelm Reich. He died in 1956, 1957, sometime around there. He was born in 1897. I remember that because my great-grandmother was born in 1896 and she lived to 2002. She was 106. And so sometimes when I look at things historical, I look at it the context of where was my great-grandmother at when this was going on? So when all this work was going on, my great-grandmother, a lot of the stuff that I'll be talking about, my great-grandmother actually had exposure to all of it, which kind of blows my mind. Anyway, Wilhelm Reich. He was actually born in a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is now regarded as Ukraine. So he was born in what is modern-day Ukraine, at the time Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he was a student of Freud's. So we'll probably talk about Freud if we have time a little bit later, but for now we're going to talk about Wilhelm Reich. So he had some very interesting philosophies and ideas. He believed that neuroses and a lot of chronic illnesses and things like cancer were actually derived from having the body have a lack of certain kinds of energies, like sexual energy, or that something was off in those energies. So Wilhelm Reich, in his interesting, and actually I think he actually probably had in some way tapped into some of the knowledge of the East if he hadn't actually studied it specifically. In any of the biographies that I read about him, nothing ever said that he actually studied anything from Buddhism or Hinduism or studied Tantra or anything like that. But the chances were he was aware of it. Around the turn of the century, that information was becoming more available to people. People were starting to become more aware of information from the East, philosophies from the East, and starting to incorporate them into their lives. And you'd find, especially from Victorian times, when Victoria herself was highly interested in all things to do with India, especially because of the British being part of the British Empire. She had a little thing for all things India. So some of those belief systems, foods, flavors, all of that kind of moved over to the West. So you're starting to see that influence starting to come into Europe. And so some of those philosophies, you start to see them coming also into Europe as well. So looking at the Austro-Hungarian Empire, we're looking at times in the early 1930s. So, right in between the world wars, we have this guy, this Wilhelm Reich, going through studying, looking at different philosophies on health and sexuality. And he was actually considered a medical doctor. So he was a doctor of medicine and a psychoanalyst. Back in the day, that is usually what would happen, is that you would become a doctor of medicine first, as the doctors of the mind were very new at the time. The whole concept of, doing medicine for the mind was probably only a few decades old. I can't remember exactly taking those courses in university. That was 30 years ago. So I don't remember the history of psychology that well, but I do know that it's that, people like Freud and those certain philosophies were coming out in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So as Wilhelm Reich was an apprentice of Freud, Freud also had some beliefs that were similar to what Reich carried on, right? So Reich, studying with Freud, had some similar thoughts, but then he also had a lot of things that varied from Freud. But I won't do like a Freud Reich comparison right now. That's not really what this is about. It's about the pioneer and what he brought to the table. So I want to give you guys a little background on him so you can kind of get the energy of like where he's coming from. He's coming from a time in between wars. So there's been a lot of devastation. He's looking to be able to have like a better, happier, healthier life, looking at different things that are going on with people, different conditions. And he's questioning like, why is this going on? And so Reich believed that neuroses in general, as well as any like physical illness like cancer, derive from a lack of what he called orgone energy. And orgone energy is essentially orgasmic energy. So Reich proposed that this energy could be restored through treatments like generating sexual orgasms in the body and sitting in things called orgone accumulation boxes. So they would collect that energy from everywhere. It wasn't just the person sitting in the box that would accumulate the orgasmic energy. It was like the life force energy of all that was around. So these orgone accumulators, I think now they're actually called more like orgone generators. You can get them. You'll probably see them at psychic fairs and health fairs. They're usually, a lot of people make them in pyramid shapes, and they have crystals in them as well as copper wire, and they're put into resin. And when the resin starts to harden, it creates what's called a piezoelectric effect. So the piezoelectric effect has to do with compression, and it generates its own energy from that compression. And there's like a low-level heat and compression that happens that generates its own energy. So I actually have these. I've made a few myself, and I place them around my different things like my technology in my home, because what I started to notice is I have like some EMF detectors, and the EMFs coming off of my computers and even off the fridge. There's like electrical low frequencies coming off the refrigerator and the microwave, even when the microwave's not on. So I have my orgone generators, not accumulators. Maybe they are accumulators as well. I have them placed around all over the house to lower those EMF and ELF frequencies. And so when people say, well, it's kind of pseudoscience, I don't know, go check it yourself. It doesn't cost you a lot to make an orgone generator, or you can go buy one. You can get yourself a little EMF tester and test it out. And why I say that is because what Reich was proposing was that if you were having a neurosis or an illness, it could actually be from different sources. It could be that there was, instead of having healthy, happy orgone energy, what could be going on was there could have been deadly orgone. So deadly orgone is like the opposite of happy, healthy orgone. And if we have too much deadly orgone, the body is corrupted and it starts to fall apart. I'm going to say the word corrupted because it feels good to say that. It starts to decay and degrade. The body's always degrading and decaying anyway, but what deadly orgone does is it speeds it up. So having these orgone generators can actually switch some of the energy. So people now, in the woo-woo world, will say, use these all the time. And the craziest, coolest thing is you can actually read a difference using an instrument that is like reads electrical low frequencies and EMFs, electromagnetic frequencies, and you can actually see a difference, which is wild. Go out, test it for yourself. These measuring devices are not impacted by you. So they're not like a machine that would be kind of like, or they're not a technology that is going to be interfered with by human thought. It's literally just reading a frequency. So that, I think, is a really cool thing to note, that you could go out and do this. So you could create your own little orgone generators. Now, what Reich had was more like a box that you sat in, so that you could sit and restore your body through treatments using this sexual orgasmic energy as it's being generated in these machines. And people would walk away feeling fantastic. So whether it was all in their mind, or whether it was, so when people say it was all in their mind, I think, wow, are our minds not incredibly powerful? Kudos to the person who did whatever all in their mind. Cool. So some people try to use that as a negation of it was all in your head. I like to think, well, if it was all in your head, kudos to you. You are magic. You are brilliant and you are magic. So to me, that doesn't negate it. It actually can sometimes make it even more potent and interesting. So a lot of Reich's theories, we'll say Reich for those Reich, his theories were, a lot of his theories on personality, the psychology side of his work are quite popular still. But the things that I find most fascinating about his work with the orgone therapy were highly, highly ignored and considered like pseudoscientific. So I don't know, test it out for yourself, guys. I like to see what it can do for me before I go and decide that it was not valid. So we're going to head to our first commercial break. You're listening to The Pleasure Zone here on Inspired Choices Network, and we'll be right back after this commercial.
Are you secretly a voyeur, wondering what's going on in other people's sex lives? What if now is the time for a totally different sexual evolution? Are you interested in people who are pioneers of different sexual and pleasurable practices? Lean in now with Milica Jelenic, where she will entice you and your body to know your own pleasure zone. On the Pleasure Zone radio show with sensual movement artist Milica Jelenic, you'll receive tools, inspiration, and a foundation to allow yourself to receive more in your sex life, and quite possibly other areas of your life as well. Listen for The Pleasure Zone with Milica every Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 7 p.m. Central Time, 6 p.m. Mountain Time, and 5 p.m. Pacific Time on InspiredChoicesNetwork.com.
Are you a subject matter expert? Are you here to share your expertise with an audience waiting to hear from you in only the way you can deliver? Are you ready to have your voice amplified across the airwaves? Inspired Choices Network has a global radio platform streaming to millions of people across the world. Professionally produced and supported by an accomplished team every step of the way, you can broadcast from anywhere in the world, knowing your voice matters, and we ensure it is delivered with ease and efficiency. Eager to hear your message, the world awaits. Contact us today to become an Inspired Choices Network radio host. Email becomeahost@inspiredchoicesnetwork.com.
This is the Pleasure Zone with sensual movement artist Milica Jelenic. To participate in the program today, join our live studio audience in our chat room at inspiredchoicesnetwork.com. You can also make the choice to ask or comment by email, info@milicajelenic.com. Now, back to the program.
Welcome back, my sweet pleasure seekers. For those of you who are just joining now, you are joining us in the midst of learning about Wilhelm Reich and his organ generating machines. Not in the midst, we're actually kind of near the end of learning about Wilhelm Reich. There is so much to learn about him, though. He's a fascinating guy. I encourage you to go research, look up any work you can find on him. He ended up spending the last 2 years of his life in prison. He was sentenced to a 2-year prison term in 1956, and he died in 1957. He died because he refused to comply with a court order regarding his organ generating work. He was considered to be in contempt of court, and I suppose that probably is what took him down in the end. He did spend a lot of his time doing a lot of work in Vienna in the 1920s prior. So he got a lot of work done in his 60 years of life. He really brought a lot of interesting theories and different practices that we still have today that I think a lot of people don't even realize. If you've ever seen those little pyramids or little shapes with the copper wire crystals in resin that's compressed, bet you didn't know that was Wilhelm Reich. Bet you didn't know that organ is actually an orgasmic energy. In Wilhelm Reich's view, he saw that as like the life-giving energy force. So this is like the generating, creating energy. And I think it's a really cool view that does really go back as far as philosophies. You can probably take it all the way back to Hindu beliefs in terms of energy and tantric work with the sexual energy, as well as anything to do with further on later on with Buddhism and practices of sexual qigong. And who knows what came first, but I do know that Buddhism did come after Hinduism, although the beliefs and the practices of the people that might have been still incorporated, those practices could have gone back thousands of years before any kind of organized type religion got involved. So that, I think, is just cool and amazing. And so if you've ever considered, that it could be just a funny thought that sex could heal or orgasms can heal, I think that Wilhelm Reich's work, even though it's considered pseudoscience, might have some merit. And I think it's well worth people inviting that and investigating that and bringing it forward again. I do know there are people that are creating organ accumulating machines to this day. They've found, I suppose they've found some of the information on how to do that. And I know from friends of friends that there are those machines out there. So if that's something you're curious about, I bet you could build your own, or I bet you could find somebody who has one to test it out. It actually, when I was looking at that, it reminded me of a movie that was done in the 60s, and in it there was it was by Woody Allen, and he had an orgasmatron in it. And I was pretty sure, looking back before knowing about Wilhelm Reich, seeing this movie like, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago by Woody Allen, I thought, oh, you know what? I bet he developed this orgasmatron based on Wilhelm Reich's work. But I could be wrong, but I could be right. So we're going to move right along to one of my other top favorite pioneers of the 20th century, and that is Betty Dodson. Betty Dodson died in 2020. I think it was January 2020. I'll have to look up the exact date, but I do know she died in 2020 at the age of 91. And she was, among many things, Betty Dodson was a very active woman in her life, well, very active in many ways. She was an American sex educator. She was an artist by training, and she did a lot of work with exotic and erotic art. She especially did that in New York. She wasn't born in New York, but she ended up moving to New York and to Manhattan when a little later on, when she was in her, I think, later on in life. She wasn't born there. So prior to her being the grandma of masturbation, she was already involved in erotic art and doing all kinds of things. Her curiosity was kind of never ending, as she still was working at her work at the age of 91, still bringing orgasms to women, facilitating that, teaching them what to do and how to do it in her workshops. So what a cool character. I hope that I can say at like the age of 91 that I'm holding workshops that allow people to have more pleasure in all areas of their life, and that maybe I get to pioneer something one day as well. I take her to be a really amazing and inspiring woman for sure. So in Betty Dodson's workshops, she would have give out manuals to assist women to learn how to masturbate. Often they would do it in groups. I do think she also did like one-on-ones, or at least it appeared she did one-on-ones, because she was in a Netflix documentary with Gwyneth Paltrow, had sent one of her employees to check out Betty Dodson and report on that. And so in that, and maybe it was just for that filming, the lady was in a one-on-one session with Betty, where they had she was in a bit of a darker room. There was some lighting. Maybe that was just for effect, but she would put a mirror in front of, have you put a mirror in front of your vulva and look at your vulva and have like a loving conversation with your vulva, because she had this awareness that we were like disconnected from our vulvas and disconnected from asking for what, vulva owners, as vulva owners, we forget to ask for what would be pleasurable. It's a lot of times been just brushed off to assume that your lover will know what to do. But most of the time, your lover has been educated by porn, and porn is not education. And if you don't know what you like, it's very hard to educate your lover on what you like. So it's really important. And what Betty Dodson's work did was make it really okay for women to masturbate. In fact, she was like probably on the cutting edge of bringing vibrators to the forefront. And not that vibrators are your ever and only source of masturbation. By all means, that's not true. You could be an all hands on person. You could be a dildo person, vibrator. You could just be one of those people who has orgasms breathing, whatever it happens to be. But Betty really was cool in that she probably just got inspired one day and had a back massager from Panasonic. I'm just imagining if I had been Betty in the day and somebody had given me a back massager, because that's what was available on the market, I probably would have tested it out. I probably would have felt like, hey, what happens if I try this? Because vibrators were not new. It's not that she invented the vibrator, it's that she had it so that the vibrators became like a household item in a way. Going back into the 1800s, and if you ever listen to any of my episodes, you'll find that going back even into the 1800s, there were vibrators. They were run by giant machinery. There were methods that people used in order to get vibrators to work. Can you imagine steam engine vibrators? There are images of that, but I don't know if there is actually any extant kind of vibrators from that time. Hard to say. It could just be images or ideas or philosophies. That I'll have to check into. Are there actually extant vibrators from the 1800s? That wasn't something I was thinking about when I was putting this show together, so I didn't do that bit of research. But what Betty did do was grab that vibrator that she had, close at hand, and she used it for the benefit of her pleasure. And then she passed that on to her friends. And one of the other things she did was she created what's called the Dodson method. And the Dodson method is where, for a lot of women, vibrators are like almost too strong. And what they can do is create almost like a desensitizing thing going on with your clitoris, because it gets like overstimulated. So what she encouraged was to dampen that, was to put like a towel in the way. And by all means, you can also do it with no towel over your clothes, whatever you happen to like. She probably tried it without that for a really long time and just went, whoo, that's, people are complaining there's overstimulation, whatever. I don't really know what had her develop that, but it is the Dodson method. So if you have ever used a vibrator over cloth of any kind, towel, clothes, whatever, you're doing the Dodson method. So congratulations to you. So she also was a big fan of having women in workshops together. And so she would have women having orgasms in groups. And, that for some people, that might be a little alarming. I remember watching a documentary. It was actually a documentary, I think it was about breasts originally. And then it changed to like women doing circles for meditation and masturbation. And that was going back to when I was about 22, I think, because I remember being in a circle of women at the time, but it wasn't a masturbation circle, it was a meditation circle. And I remember bringing it up and they were all mortified, or they seemed mortified. Maybe they were interested. Maybe I read it wrong. Anyhow, so Betty and her circles, it brought probably a lot of joy and relief, especially to women who probably felt repressed. And if in groups of women where they felt safe, if they were women who had been abused, sexually abused, physically abused, mentally, emotionally abused by men, then perhaps these circles would also be healing. So we're learning techniques. Betty has taught techniques, and she's also healed many, many, many people. And her work continues to do so even after her passing. So to the grandmummy of masturbation, cheers to Betty. And she also, in her life, she wrote several books. So I just want to let you guys know about those if you ever would like to go out and get some of those. So her first one was Liberating Masturbation, a meditation on self-love. And she actually wrote and illustrated that herself. She really wanted to include and be super inclusive with disabled women, or women with mobility issues. Sorry, I think that was worded incorrectly. At the time when she wrote it, I think that was called disability. So mobility issues. And then also for everybody to just be able to have access to learn about masturbation. So one of the other things she did was she made a documentary that ended up on, I think it might still be on YouTube. It was called The Internal Clitoris, where Betty actually explains the size of the clitoris. So she shows her drawing, in the film, it shows her drawing the clitoris from what's called a long horse shoe structure, the long horse shoe structure deep inside. So the whole clitoris. So not just the tip of the iceberg, but how it kind of like wraps around everything. And that was one that I think was mind-blowing for a lot of people. So she did that in 2007. And that is something that, when you're looking at anatomy and you're looking at the vulva, they don't draw how far reaching the clitoris is. And with 8,000 nerve endings, it certainly has to all come from somewhere and come to the very tip, right? So Betty, we love you. And we're going to head to our next commercial break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some of my more favorite pioneers of sexual liberation. You're listening to The Pleasure Zone here on Inspired Choices Network, and we'll be right back after this commercial.
Are you secretly a voyeur, wondering what's going on in other people's sex lives? What if now is the time for a totally different sexual evolution? Are you interested in people who are pioneers of different sexual and pleasurable practices? Lean in now with Milica Jelenic, where she will entice you and your body to know your own pleasure zone. On the Pleasure Zone radio show with sensual movement artist Milica Jelenic, you'll receive tools, inspiration, and a foundation to allow yourself to receive more in your sex life, and quite possibly other areas of your life as well. Listen for the Pleasure Zone with Milica every Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 7 p.m. Central Time, 6 p.m. Mountain Time, and 5 p.m. Pacific Time on InspiredChoicesNetwork.com.
Interested in masturbating for money, copulating for consciousness, and pleasuring on purpose? 21 Days of Sexual Magicism with sensual movement artist Milica Jelenic is an exploration of tools, processes, and actions that you can use to create more for your life, your body, your money inflows, and so much more. Graduated learning for all levels of interest. Learn at your own pace via video classes or join the yearly live class. Take a peek at www.milicajelenic.com.
How wonderful would it be to carry your favorite Inspired Choices Network host with you throughout your day? Well, now you can. Inspired Choices Network now has its very own mobile app. Our free app offers live streaming shows, along with thousands of podcasts and TV episodes. Our shows cover a wide variety of topics. Whether you're waking up with us, carrying us through the day, and taking us to bed with you, we're always here for you to enjoy. We're easy to find. Just search for Inspired Choices Network in the Apple App Store or Google Play Store.
This is the Pleasure Zone with sensual movement artist Milica Jelenic. To participate in the program today, join our live studio audience in our chat room at InspiredChoicesNetwork.com. You can also make the choice to ask or comment by email, info@milicajelenic.com. Now, back to the program.
Welcome back, my sweet pleasure seekers. I've been having fun sharing some of my favorite pioneers of sexual liberation with you today. We've been talking about Wilhelm Reich, Dr. Wilhelm Reich, and his work with orgone energy and orgone accumulating machines, and just orgone accumulators. I don't think he called it a machine. And Betty Dodson and her being the grandmummy of masturbation. Now we're going to move on to Ernst Gräfenberg. I bet you have no idea who this guy is, or maybe you do. Just think of the letter that his last name starts with, G. G. What would he be the sexual pioneer liberator for? And actually there's a liberator that is used for people who have the experiences for which that G is named after. So the G spot was named after Ernst Gräfenberg, and he was a gynecologist, and he lived in what he was actually born in 1881, died in 1957, and he died in New York. He was born, and I think he was born in Germany, Munich, and he was a medical doctor, a scientist, and as a medical doctor, he was mostly a gynecologist, like an OBGYN. And he started working as a gynecologist around 1910. So he was actually pretty young. He was only 19 years old when he did that. He was really young when, oh, sorry, not 9, he's 29 when he did that. He was 24 when he got his doctorate. So he was still really young as a doctor back then. So he served in the First World War as a medical officer, and then he actually started to do a lot of work. I'm not going to have a lot of time to jump into him, but I'm going to give you as much info as I can. So Ernst was Jewish, and so you can imagine that he's a doctor in the First World War. By the time in the 1930s that he's studying gynecology and obstetrics, and or he's working with that, and things are happening in Germany in the 30s, he actually thought he was going to be safe. So he stayed in Germany for a bit, even though there was stuff going on that gave him every indicator that things were not safe for Jewish people in Germany at the time. So he ended up getting arrested, and he ended up having some friends help him. And the friends were part of the International Society of Sexology, and they helped him escape Germany in 1940 and emigrate to California. He died in 1957, so he's another one of our great pioneers who died in 1957. He did a lot of work studying female genitals and female sexual physiology in general. And so what he realized, in one of his key papers that he wrote, was the role of urethra in female orgasms. And that was written in 1950. So this is before the Kinsey reports were coming out. And we're going to have some time to talk about Kinsey after too. Kinsey you probably have heard of. If you have watched any, I think it's in the Masters, and I haven't watched the Masters yet, but it is probably in them. I would think they would have put Kinsey in the Masters, as he is one of the top the Kinsey reports were some of the top information on human sexuality being more of a gray area rather than you're this or you're that. And so it became very gray and interesting. And there was a spectrum of sexuality rather than binary kind of sexuality. So we're going to head back to Ernst Gräfenberg and his brilliance of studying female genitalia. And we're going to, in this case, I'm referring to as female as in identified female at birth. So that would be like AFAB, assigned female at birth. Although sometimes when you're assigned female at birth, you don't necessarily have everything internal that matches that. So in this case, we're going with the medical term, not the gender or anything to do with the terms that would be more gender related rather than sexual, being sexually identified by doctors at birth. Okay, just want to be clear on that. I know there's conversation there, and sometimes people get upset about it, and I get that. These are studies that were done in the 50s, and there wasn't a lot of conversation about that then. So it was described as female orgasm in 1950, which is even cool that they were even acknowledging that that was existing and that it was something to consider. So he described female ejaculation, and he described where to find that erotic zone, which is, where the urethra is closest to the vaginal wall. And then later on, there's a person we're going to be kind of throwing in here as well, John Perry and Beverly Whipple. So Beverly Whipple is known for naming, in an article, naming the Grafenberg spot, the G spot, after him. So even though this area was kind of in medical writing, it wasn't a common language until 1981. So, if you talk to your great grandmothers about the G spot in 1970, they would have no idea what you were talking about. They might have been aware a bit of female ejaculation if they'd ever experienced it by accident, but it wasn't common language, and it wasn't common knowledge on how to access it or what to do with it. When you find it, what do you do? How do you approach this very vague thing called the G spot? So yeah, Beverly Whipple. She's on my list of people that I wanted to talk about for sexual pioneers and liberators, and she is the one who named the G spot the G spot. So in there was kind of a quiet lull you can kind of see from 1950 when that article went out to by the time the Grafenberg spot got named the G spot. So what were we doing all the rest of the time? And thank you to Ernst Gräfenberg for doing the studies to find out what was going on with female anatomy, what we're going to, biological AFAB female anatomy, what was going on there, what else was possible for women and orgasms. And what a beautiful thing that he was, interested enough to learn more about that. Would we have found G-spots anyways? Maybe. Did his information and the work of Beverly Whipple making that information public make it a little easier for people to learn about it? Absolutely. I remember in the 80s having, I think, somebody who was an absolute pioneer of sexuality in Canada. So she was Sue. Sex with Sue, and she was a nurse, and she had a sex talk radio show every Sunday night from 8 to 10, and I used to listen to her all the time. And it was probably from when I was about 12 years old on, and I remember hearing about this elusive G-spot when I was 12, fascinated by it. And there had only been articles, it had only been named about 6 years prior. So I was 12 in 1987. And so that article was written in 1981. And that means that sex with Sue Johansson was right on the cutting edge. She was always keeping herself educated and up to date on information. And she was, really able to bring that information to the forefront. So I want to just throw Sue Johansson in there as a pioneer as well, because of what she did for Canadians, in the same way that Dr. Ruth Westheimer did for many other people. And a lot of other people know, especially in the US, about Dr. Ruth. In Canada, we know about Sue Johansson. So, and I bet in other countries, you've all got your Dr. Ruth or your Sue Johansson. So shout out to all of those doctors, the sexologists, every of the experts that were working in the field of human sexuality, especially in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and bringing that to the forefront in a time when we really needed information, especially because with the AIDS scare, with people needing more information, needing to find out how to be safe, they were bringing a lot of information to the table that people were afraid to ask. And there wasn't a lot of information that was available. So having experts in the field be able to talk about these things in a way that wasn't scary, that was educational, that kept you interested, was really important, right? So it wasn't boring, and it didn't sound like you were going to a medical lecture. They were both Dr. Ruth and Sue Johansson were fascinating and kept people interested in what they were talking about. So throwing in a few extras on the list for inspirations from the back in the last century. And so we've got two more that I'm gonna try and fit into our next group, our next 10 minutes, our last 10 minutes. We're going to talk about Magnus Hirschfeld and Alfred Charles Kinsey being the one who did the Kinsey reports. So we will talk about them when we come back from this commercial break. You're listening to the Pleasure Zone here on Inspired Choices Network, and we'll be right back after this commercial.
Are you secretly a voyeur, wondering what's going on in other people's sex lives? What if now is the time for a totally different sexual evolution? Are you interested in people who are pioneers of different sexual and pleasurable practices? Lean in now with Milica Jelenic, where she will entice you and your body to know your own pleasure zone. On the Pleasure Zone radio show with sensual movement artist Milica Jelenic, you'll receive tools, inspiration, and a foundation to allow yourself to receive more in your sex life, and quite possibly other areas of your life as well. Listen for the Pleasure Zone with Milica every Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 7 p.m. Central Time, 6 p.m. Mountain Time, and 5 p.m. Pacific Time on InspiredChoicesNetwork.com. This is the Pleasure Zone with sensual movement artist Milica Jelenic. To participate in the program today, join our live studio audience in our chat room at InspiredChoicesNetwork.com. You can also make the choice to ask or comment by email, info@MilicaJelenic.com. Now, back to the program.
Welcome back, my sweet pleasure seeker multiples. Thank you for you guys, and thank you for listening. If you are interested in all things to do with human sexuality and you have fun things going on and you're interested in having some topics talked about on this show, feel free to write to me and send in suggestions. I've done several suggestions from different listeners, and I love getting emails and letters from the listeners about what they heard on my show, what inspired them, what they'd like to hear, and I love working with that. If you are an avid listener and I haven't responded to your emails yet, I'm sorry, and I will get there. Sometimes I get a little bit behind, and sometimes the mail gets lost in my junk mail, and I have to go find that and recover it. So and also, if you'd like to book a 15-minute appointment with me, if you've never worked with me, if you're curious about working with me, if you've got something going on and you'd like some coaching, I offer 15 minutes free to anybody who chooses that. And more time than that, I do charge. So you can go over to my website at milicajelenic.com, MILICAJELENIC.com, and you can book 15 minutes for free with me, or you can book more time. It just isn't free. So we're going to move on to another fabulous pioneer of the day, Magnus Hirschfeld. And Magnus Hirschfeld was really on the cutting edge of working with sex, gender, and sexuality. He had groundbreaking and radical ideas. He ended up being exiled, I guess, exiled out of Germany in the 30s. And the Nazi Party was not very fond of his ideas about gender and sexuality. The Nazis often attacked Hirschfeld's work and destroyed many of his files and collections. So there was probably a lot more information that he did collect in history. There was a lot more stuff that he could have, that he offered the world that got destroyed. So, yeah, the violence, the things that got lost in the Holocaust to, human life, and, so much stuff got lost. So we're going to just go kudos to Hirschfeld. Thank you for your work. His theories on sexuality and gender were really cutting edge for the 19th century and early 20th century. His ideas on the nature of human sexuality became really important, especially for scientific investigation. People would look into, there were scientists now looking into some of his theories, as well as he himself doing a lot of research as well. Germany at the time was, and this may be surprising to a lot of people, Germany was really at the forefront of a lot of things when it came to sexuality, particularly. It was, I'm not going to get into a super big history lesson on this, but some of the first, some of the most open places in the world for human sexuality and being LGBTQ, being open about all of that, was actually Berlin in the 1930s. And some of the first people who got pulled into concentration camps or marked with the pink triangle were, a lot of them were Jewish that were not in the realm of straight. They fell into the LGBTQ, and they were some of the first ones that got pulled into concentration camps. So it had been a really open country, and then holy cow, did it ever not. So later on, a lot of Hirschfeld's theories, because they were destroyed, we don't have access to them, but some of the work still remained because there were people he was working with, there were other doctors he was working with. So a lot of the materials he wrote were meant to reach the general public so people could understand them. So a lot of people had read them. He had created pamphlets and books and journals, so they weren't able to totally destroy all of his work, although some of his studies were definitely destroyed. So his theories on sexuality, he promoted like new theories of sexuality, which probably really helped Alfred Kinsey in his work later on to then observe it. Kinsey liked observing things. So his, Hirschfeld's theories on same-sex love and desire were pretty outstanding and cutting edge in his day. And he he completely challenged the common idea that same-sex attraction was a pathological perversion. And actually, I think it was until the DSM-4, I think the DSM-3 still had, which is a diagnostic tool, psychological diagnostic tool for different pathological or psychological conditions. And same-sex attraction was considered a pathological perversion, even to the DSM-3. And I think it wasn't until I was in university, maybe just a couple of years before, so sometime in maybe the late 80s, early 90s, the DSM-4 came out, which was the first time that same-sex attraction being a pathological perversion was actually put out of the DSM and no longer regarded as like an issue, a psychological issue. So he argued that it was inborn, that we were born with our sexuality and our attraction to people. So really huge. So thank you, Hirschfeld, for that. I want to make sure we get Kinsey in here too. So if you've never read anything about Hirschfeld, I think you'll find him fascinating because he's one of those unsung heroes that brought a lot of information to the forefront, but a lot of people don't talk about him or know about him. Kinsey, on the other hand, I think a lot of people have heard about Kinsey, or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's just in the circles that I play in that people talk about Kinsey and are aware of the significance of the Kinsey reports. So Alfred Kinsey was born in 1894 and he died in 1956. Yet again, another one of those boys who died in the 50s. And he was born in Hoboken, New Jersey, and he died in Bloomington, Indiana. And he did a lot of work. Actually, you can find, there's a movie called The Kinsey Syndrome that you can watch if you've never seen that. I saw parts of that in university when we were studying Kinsey. So the Kinsey reports, they actually sold nearly 1 million copies in the Kinsey reports, and they were translated into 13 languages. They were actually a way to change the public's perception of sexuality. So those reports showed that, human sexuality was definitely more of a spectrum than something that was binary. And I think Hirschfeld's work helped to open the doors to that. And then Kinsey really started to give more and more information on that. So one of the greatest contributions that he did was that he gave evidence for, we'll call it gay biology, like that you actually are born gay and that you weren't babied into. So the philosophy prior to that was that you were spoiled into being gay. And so my grandpa, when he was studying medicine in the 40s, that's what they were taught, is you were spoiled into being gay, instead of, if you weren't spoiled, you weren't gay, but if you were spoiled, you would be gay. And Alfred Kinsey made it evident and allowed people to really become aware of the fact that this is innate biological nature, which is the work that Magnus Hirschfeld was wanting to bring to the forefront. And so Kinsey actually started to see that in all of the evidence of all of the reports and studies he did. So we had some pretty amazing people, definitely over the last century, that contributed to human sexuality and allowing us to have conversations like I have every week with you guys. In order to be able to have conversations like this, all the people before me had to make it okay to talk about this, to make it safe, to provide us with information, insights, and all their education, knowledge, and time that went into this. All of their years and years and decades of work all contribute to everything that I get to offer you guys these days, right at my fingertips. And so I think they are the unsung heroes, the unacknowledged. There's so many more of them, but they are amazing information that we now just take for granted. We all know about the Jesus, and who knew, that Ernst Gräfenberg was studying, had to escape, Nazi Germany, had all these things happen just to bring us that information in 1950 in his research. So yeah, for all of them, that are no longer in their bodies, just putting out a great big thank you to all that they did to bring us everything that we know today, so that we can all have a little happier, more pleasurable life.
Thank you for listening to The Pleasure Zone with sensual movement artist Milica Jelenic. The Pleasure Zone returns next Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Mountain, and 5 p.m. Pacific on InspiredChoicesNetwork.com. We hope you'll join us. Until then, have the best week of your life by choosing to be turned on and tuned in to your body.